Welcome to the podcast. It's so great to be in conversation again.
Well, we're happy to be here with you all.
Yeah, you guys are like our coolest friends. And we've never even met in person. But we've stalked you for so long that I feel like we can go ahead and call it friends at this point.
Yes,
and
that.
And I just feel cooler that Gabe and Rebekah Lyons even know who we are. Because we've admired your work for so long, and it's always fun to hang out, and we're excited about today.
Mm-hmm. Well, Dave and Ashley, we respect so much of what you're doing. And I think one of the things that I love about you is that you're just willing to go there. And the reason why I think your podcast is so compelling, your work is so compelling, is people are just looking for people to tell the truth and to not shy away from the hard conversations, especially the ones in marriage that can implode a marriage. And so today we are going to just talk all about sex. And I'm grateful that you're willing to do this. Obviously you are, because you wrote a book about it. And I know that comes with a lot of research, a lot of nuance, a lot of just honest conversations. And knowing this is such a charged topic, it's a painful topic. It's a topic that people feel shame around. And thank you for doing this, and thank you for being a part of this conversation.
Yeah, so let's jump right into this conversation, because you guys talk to so many people. You have your own EXO marriage conferences that you do all over the country, and I know the sex conversation comes up, and sometimes it's the men that seem most interested in that conversation, right? And it's usually motivated by they're like, I'm not getting enough sex. We're not having sex enough. What do I need to do to have more sex? And almost frames the conversation wrongly. But it's motivated out of thinking like this is supposed to be happening in a healthy marriage. We're supposed to be connecting in an intimate way. So curious for you guys, just you decided to write this book called The Counterfeit Climax, and you engage this topic very easily and readily, and you're not afraid to go there. How important is sex and healthy sex in a good marriage?
Well, it's huge. I think that some of the mistakes we make is that we either make sex everything, like there's this trend sometimes in culture, sometimes in our own individual marriages, where sex is the only barometer we use for how things are going, and we're measuring it by frequency. Like if we're not having sex X number of times per whatever, then our whole marriage is falling apart, and it becomes the metric that we base everything on. Or on the other extreme, there are a lot of folks that just don't talk about it at all. It's something that's not happening with any real frequency in their marriage, and they're just uncomfortable with it. And maybe that discomfort's a result from baggage they brought into the marriage. And there's all different kinds of baggage people can bring in, and that's something we talk about in the book and we talk about on our Naked Marriage podcast, is that everybody has some form of sexual baggage. Even if you entered into marriage as a virgin, which is awesome, we all have some baggage just from the mindsets that we picked up related to sex, from our own insecurities, from our own mindsets and expectations about the way it's supposed to look and where those expectations come from. Some of us have been victims of sexual abuse, which of course brings a whole separate load of trauma into the bedroom. And yet everybody's got some of this stuff, but so few couples are actually honestly talking about it. And so we're just trying to create safe places. And I'm so thankful for you guys, Gabe and Rebekah, just for hosting conversations like this, where the conversation can be had. Because sometimes the act of talking about sex can feel more vulnerable and intimate than the actual act of making love. But when couples get to that place where they're willing to talk about it, they're willing to open up about it with one another and find healing for maybe those places they've been wounded in this area, it's amazing what God can do to restore not only this aspect of their marriage, but even the wounded parts of their own hearts.
Right. Absolutely. Because intimacy isn't just the act, it's the vulnerability all across the board, whether it's just the confession, honestly, like any level of resentment or bitterness that might have crept in. And sometimes you're going through the act, but you're actually not being truthful. You're not being fully exposed. And I think sometimes we think that like sex is that is the counterfeit, right? That we're going to still do the thing, and yet we're not connected. There might be growing resentment. And because what you just described as too much or not enough around the topic, I think can happen in one marriage, right? One person is hyper focused on it. One would rather avoid it. And it's almost like one feeds the other's perspective, because one feels a little more standoffish. The other person's a little more, intentional. And then that can create more of a gap. So for you guys, share with us how this kind of, you find this freedom in your own marriage and to really find that vulnerability. Did you start that way, or is this something you kind of tripped into a few years in? Like, hey, we need to be a little more forthcoming on this.
Oh, goodness. No, I feel like they always say, like, you write the book that you need to read or that you maybe wanted to read back in the day, like you wished you had that information. And that's definitely true for us. Like we came into marriage from very different backgrounds. And, we did wait for marriage. We weren't perfect. So we had that. But I do think Dave, and you can speak to this, I think you built it up like the thing.
Right. Yeah. We had very, very different expectations coming in. And some of it was just like the homes we came up in. Ashley's parents, I love them. They're amazing, but they don't really show affection outwardly. And they never talked about this in her home. It was like the topic was shut down if it ever came up. And my parents were like all over each other. I joke, they were 50 shades of middle age. It was like,
and still are.
It creeped me out, but I just thought that was normal that you were, just very outwardly affectionate. And so I felt like, well, once we get married, it's like all we're going to do. And then I'd also kind of, to add to that and complicate it, I'd sabotaged my own mind in that as a teenager into early adulthood, I had fallen into pornography like so many people are currently struggling with, which is why we talk so openly about porn, because it's the ultimate counterfeit. It's something that just unravels God's beautiful plan for sex. But I had poisoned my mind with porn, and it had, just reshaped in a negative way the way that I saw myself, the way that I saw others, the way that I created expectations around sex. And so we entered into marriage, and I had all that baggage from porn and all these expectations that we were just going to just make love all the time, and that's what it was going to be. Ashley, she came in with like a completely different set of expectations. And so right from the start, we were learning to try to navigate this really kind of complicated, messy rhythm of trying to figure out what's this really supposed to look like. And those early years were just awkward. I mean, I think that's probably the best way to put it. It was just awkward for a while.
Definitely awkward. And, I think too, because I came from a home, and I love my parents dearly, and they've been married forever, like over 40 years. And I'm so proud of them. But I think that they had kind of some things in their past that they did not want to talk about with me and my sister. And so I think that's what a lot of people do, is if they feel like they had maybe a promiscuous past or a past that maybe they're still dealing with some stuff from there or have shame associated with it, they really shut down those conversations because they are afraid of the questions they might get. And that was my parents. And so, I kid you not, I'm 20 years old, getting ready to walk down the aisle to marry Dave. And my mom, within like 15 minutes of this happening, like grabs my arm and says, "Oh my gosh, I probably should talk to you about what's going to happen tonight," And I, and I was like, "Mom, I think I know what I need to know at this point, And I'm like, "I appreciate you, acknowledging that now." But I was one of those teenagers where I did have questions. Like I would hear stuff at school, and I would come home and I would ask about different things that turned out to be a sexual act. But I was pretty, I don't know if shelter's the word, but just innocent. I mean, I don't even know if it was on purpose for my parents, but like I didn't know a lot. And I'm the firstborn in my family. And when I would come home and ask about things, genuinely trying to understand what my friends were talking about and just wanting to understand, my mom would just freak out. And so here I am, like 20 years later, I'm getting ready to marry Dave. And I just don't know what to think about sex. Like on one hand, I'm really excited. On the other hand, I'm terrified. And then there's this huge thing that I dealt with probably in the first several years where I'm just feeling inadequate, like feeling completely inadequate. And then you throw in about, I would say probably a couple years into our marriage, would you say a couple years, is when I found the pornography on our computer in our dingy basement. I was looking for something for my school. I was still in school at the time, and found it by accident. And then that really, really made me feel inadequate. I mean, I was mad, sad, disgusted, angry, shocked. I mean, all the different feelings. But I really dealt with, really for several years afterwards, just as we were healing, just this deep-seated inadequacy. And I really feel like, too, it was something that the enemy really tried to use on me time and time again. And so we had to definitely deal with that as well.
So when you found that, how did you handle that with Dave immediately? And what did that conversation look like between the two of you? How did you respond? Because I think what the moment you're describing right now is what countless marriages go through. The exposure, the revelation, the kind of what is hidden becomes to the surface. And it literally devastates, like from that moment forward, how people respond. So what did that look like for you guys?
Well, I wish I could say that I had just had the courage to confess this before it was found, but I didn't. Like, she found it, and then I was confronted with it.
Well, because I
And
called you immediately. Well,
yeah,
I would say like I waited like 10 minutes to just gather myself. And again, I was mostly in shock. I'm sorry, sweetie, I
no,
didn't
go
mean to cut
ahead.
you off. But I did call you at work, and what did I say?
She said, "Do you have something you need to tell me?" And man, if your wife ever calls and tells you that, just start confessing to like everything. In third grade, I skipped class. In fourth grade, I stole a candy bar. Go all the way up to present and tell her everything you haven't told her. But I knew exactly, and I was sick in my stomach, but I was also thankful that it was finally out, and that was the beginning of the healing. Is like just a cancerous tumor being cut out, and it's messy and painful. But it's once something's out in the light, it doesn't have the same power it has over you when you keep it in the darkness. And so her finding that created the conversation for me to just say, "You found it," and to tell her how sorry I was, and to confess kind of that this is something I'd struggled with and I'd kept in secret, and how wrong that had been, and how wrong I had been, and how I wanted to be free from this. And it put us on a path toward healing. And even that path was messy, because at the time I've never had like a chemical substance addiction, but I really feel like, looking back, that I was addicted at the time. And I wasn't sure how to navigate my way out of that. And so there were one or two relapses in those early months of coming out of it. And through it all, I mean, Ashley was so supportive. I mean, she was full of grace, but also full of firm boundaries that needed to be enforced through love. And she walked that balance in a way that I'm so thankful for her wisdom during that time, because that combination of her grace and that combination of her, not standing for it as she shouldn't, and it really created an atmosphere, I think, where healing could happen faster than it would have otherwise. And so her heroism and wisdom through that season not only helped me to be strong enough to walk out of it, but I think it really is the main reason that not only we're still married today, but that we're able to do the work that we do now, helping other couples. And so she's the hero of that story, as she's the hero of really most of our stories. Jesus and Ashley are the hero of almost all. Jesus is the hero of all of our stories. Ashley's the hero of along with Jesus, of most of them. And yeah, I'm thankful for that. It was many years ago, and that was a different time. It was before smartphones existed. It was before a lot of the channels that now make porn even more accessible. And so the numbers now, the people that are struggling right now, it's even more staggering. And I'm sure that breaking free from it is even more complicated, because we carry around in our pockets, something that gives us 24/7 access. And so if you're listening right now and you're struggling with this, just know there's hope. But you have to take that first step, and you have to bring it out into the light, and you have to invite accountability in, and you have to start that road toward freedom. And I promise you, it's worth it. It is so worth it to be on the other side and to be free from it.
Yeah. Ashley, I'm curious. I mean, obviously the Lord graced you to walk with him in it. And even though the sting of betrayal obviously kind of was a confrontation right there. And I think for a lot of women and men, that exposure moment, to have the grace to go like, I'm with you in this. Like, I know that you're a man of integrity. Like you have that in you, that integrity in you. So how were you able to kind of even separate your own hurt, obviously, like the rejection that communicated to you, but still to see him as an image bearer, to kind of call that truth and goodness out of him? Because I mean, honestly, that takes quite a bit of spiritual maturity, obviously. And I think what happens sometimes in marriages is that the reason one party will not expose themselves is they can't fathom that the person that they would confess to would actually believe in them on the other side of that. How did you do that?
No, I think you're exactly right. I think that's why so many people hold it in, because they're like, this is my cross to bear. We've literally heard people say this, like, my sin is my cross to bear, because it would hurt my spouse more for them to know, and they could never, ever forgive me. They could never deal with it. That is the lie from the enemy that he wants us to believe so much. So I'm so glad that when I did ask Dave that he confessed it to me. And Dave paints me as like this saint over here, but I mean, there were days where I was like so angry with him and so disgusted with him and so just frustrated and discouraged and not sure if we were going to get through this or if we were just going to have to settle for this being kind of part of our lives. Like, that's just very natural, just to be really honest with you guys. Like, that's a natural thing that people deal with when they're dealing with this particular issue. And I will tell you, when I would have my little pity parties and I would start to think that I'm so great and couldn't do something like Dave did with pornography, the Holy Spirit set me right real fast. And it was like, I mean, I'm so glad, I'm so thankful for that. And it was just like, anytime I felt that way, it would, he would remind me, Ashley, how many times have I forgiven you in your lifetime today, every minute? Like, how many times? And just reminding me that I'm imperfect. I need grace every single minute of the day. And, maybe pornography is not my issue, but there's other things that I've had to deal with that Dave's walked through with me. And that for him, this was a stronghold in his life, and it doesn't define him. This is not who he is. This is sin in his life that he's been gripped by, but that we serve a God that is greater than anything we could deal with. And I knew that we were gonna fare so much better if I could come alongside Dave and walk with him and help pick him up when he's feeling down on those rough days, than kick him while he's down. And I think that that's important in any kind of issue that we're dealing with in marriage, not just pornography, not even just sexual issues. I think that we need to remember that all of us are flawed human beings, that we live in a broken world, that none of us have arrived. There's always things like maybe we've been in a strong season where we haven't been gripped by sin like pornography in our lives. But let me tell you, the minute we start thinking, man, I'm so beyond this, I'll never have to deal with that, is the very time when the enemy loves to come in and grip us by something and make us believe that we have to keep it a secret. And then before you know it, we're caught up in that web of lies and deceit and secrecy. And so I think we have to keep a humility about us to go through things like this. And that's, God worked on both of us during that time. It wasn't just Dave healing, it was me too. And I think that I had to realize too, that I couldn't look to Dave to fill this hole of inadequacy. I think, it wasn't even just tied to the pornography, but just having these feelings of inadequacy. It really taught me that, that whole kind of thought of "you complete me" from Jerry Maguire all those years ago. I know a lot of our young listeners are going to be like, what are you talking about? But there was a movie, really popular movie, kind of right before we got married, where they kind of, you guys know what I'm talking about. There was this narrative of how, for men and women, like they're just looking for that person to complete them. And I think I kind of bought into that. And I think that when I found this pornography, it's like the bubble burst a little bit. And I think that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. I realized that, only God can fill that hole. I can't look to Dave to complete me. I'm complete in Christ, but we are two, complete individuals in Christ coming together and loving each other and walking this life together. And so, even though I wouldn't want to go through that time again, we learned so much through that time. And I believe that God really brought us closer through it.
Yeah. Wow, that's so good.
I know. And, there's so much more to be said about pornography, and it's not only a male problem.
Right.
I mean, women are encountered by this. And today, like you said, Dave, on the smartphones, it's just ubiquitous. It's everywhere. No one can avoid the temptation. It's just,
it hunts you down.
it's been made very easy, and it's confusing people. And I know you kind of mentioned this, but it changes expectations. So husbands who are watching porn or women who are watching porn, it can start to just map the brain in such a way that they need something more. They need something to excite them a little bit more, and it keeps pushing. And you start to hear these stories where husbands and wives no longer just enjoying sex. Like, it becomes this event. I mean, it's like a big thing that they're having to get ready for and figure it out. And I just think in that scenario, in this culture, how do we fight for the purity of marriage, the purity of what God's design was for sexuality, where sex isn't just sex, it's like a climax, but that it's much more of what we're talking about? How do we try to reclaim that ground in this culture?
Well, I think it's just as simple as starting by going back to the truth of what God's word says about sex. And the farther we get away from that, and the more we look to the culture or entertainment or porn or whatever else to kind of be the barometer we're using to gauge what healthy sex should be, then the farther off course we're going to get. And when we look around at all the sexual brokenness and confusion in our culture right now, and even sometimes in our individual marriages right now, and I think it's just an opportunity to to have a reset and to go back and say, like, Lord, again, this along with all parts of our life, like, I want to commit this to you. And I feel like sometimes as Christians, like our sex life is maybe the last part of us to totally get saved. It's like, God, I'll give you everything else. Little bit at a time. I'll give you my eternity, my heart, all those things. But this part, I don't fully trust you with yet. And I think maybe it's because we feel like God's plan for sex is going to somehow be limiting or boring, or maybe we're not courageous enough to talk to even Him about the real insecurities on a heart level that we have. But if we'll go back and just remind ourselves of the truth that we're a new creation in Christ, that we can be set free from whatever shame or baggage we're carrying, and that sex is a gift meant to be enjoyed with freedom between a husband and a wife, I think that reset can really help a lot of couples to start moving forward. Because most couples who are stuck in a rut of either not having sex very often, or maybe when they do, it's just sort of disconnected from the emotional and soul aspect. They're just sort of physically going through the motions, or one's always pursuing and the other one is always kind of pushing away. Like whatever the frustrating dynamic is, all of those couples can experience healing. There's not a one size fits all. Here's the equation. It has to look this exact way for every couple, but every couple can experience health and experience a great sex life. And it starts by just trusting it in God's hands and then really talking about it. And with the Counterfeit Climax book, more than anything else, it's really just a resource to guide couples through the conversations that are going to help them work through the baggage and get to those breakthroughs.
That's so good. I've often heard, porn versus like sexual intimacy in marriage is that porn is like marriage is something you give, and then porn is something you take, like where sex is, it's turned into a consumption, something that's about the person being gratified, versus in marriage, the goal here is that we're coming together in union, like that there's a joining here of generosity, of giving. And I think that's obviously an illustration of marriage in general, right? That we're bringing our whole selves to one another. And when we say naked, which is what your podcast is about, but it's not just physically naked, it's emotionally naked and fully present in our weakness, in our vulnerability. For just a moment, I just want to address like our youth, our kids. What they're growing up in is very different than what we grew up in. Like I resonate with you. I kind of got a book on how to become a woman, and that was how I learned about sex. And it was like some sketches, I think, from like the 60s. So it wasn't really talked about a whole lot in my upbringing either. But what that does, I think, unfortunately, is it makes kids more curious, and then they go wherever they can find content. And unfortunately, those places that they're going are not, biblically grounded. And now in a sexualized society, everything is up for grabs. And I think even the porn that our kids have so readily fed to them without them even trying to find it or looking for it involves a lot of same-sex porn. And so what happens here is like there's a lot of confusion, I think, even in those formation years of puberty into adolescence, into adulthood on identity, even just like where we are. Like if I was attracted to something that was same sex, then all of a sudden, does that make me a lesbian? And so I was curious, or for men, same thing. I'm just curious because I think when I was talking to some girls a year ago that were like, they're like, if you could say one thing, if you could just say that just because you had the attraction does not form identity. And I would love for you guys to unpack that a little bit, because I think as people enter college or enter adult life, there's a big question mark around something. Someone once said, well, that just means your parts work. That doesn't mean that forms identity. And so talk a little bit about that, if you don't mind, because I do think that's that conversation keeps coming back up.
Oh, yeah. My goodness. I mean, you said it so well, Rebekah. Like, it's just so pervasive. The whole kind of pushing exploration, I think, is a big, big agenda with our youth and the college age especially. It's like, well, you don't know if you haven't tried. And, do you really know what you like? Do you really know what you're attracted to? And so it is kind of pushed off on our kids, and that's very confusing. And I think that, too, when it comes to the attraction, kind of just that word alone, like what are you attracted to? What are your eyes drawn to? we kind of explain it this way, like as human beings, we're drawn to a naked human body. It's just like that ignites something in us because we are, we're made to be attracted to that. And I think that nakedness in and of itself, especially in the porn culture, that can be really confusing, especially like you said, if it ends up being like a same sex or something. And I think that in the culture today, they're saying, well, what you're attracted to is who you are. Like that's what they're trying to say. Like it is every bit of who you are, rally with those people. Those are your people, and then run with it. And really it's like, this isn't, sex is something in marriage that we get to experience to connect as a husband and wife. And it is very binding. It's binding to bind the marriage together. And that's how God designed it. But it is not, our identity. It's not the definition of who we are. And I think that there's so much weight put on that today that, I don't know. It just seems like even with our own boys, there's all these different labels they want to put on themselves and trying out these different labels. And I do think it's very confusing. And I think that as parents, and even just to the youth who are listening, we have to realize that we are sons and daughters of God. Sex is part of who we are. And we do need to watch where our eyes go, because it can be, it's alluring. It's something that we can get caught up in. And so we don't need to allow, though, these thoughts of getting hyper focused on attraction, just lending our thoughts to that. Because, with neuroscience, they say like, what you think on the most, it literally makes like a ridge in your brain. So it becomes like this automatic thought. And it doesn't mean you can't overcome those, but there's sometimes I think the enemy uses that to just plague these people. And that's where you see anxiety come in, and they're having this crisis of sexuality issues. And then feeling like they need to go play this out and see where this goes. And it just ends up in a lot more confusion, and it kind of breeds on itself.
Yeah. And just to add quickly to that, I feel like the root of all of the sexual confusion in our whole era, it comes down to these identity questions. Yeah. It's not even really about sex as much as it's about identity. And I think everything that where Jesus offers us something that's genuine, the enemy comes in and tries to offer a counterfeit version. And I feel like with sexuality, with transgenderism, with all these things, really at the root of it more than anything else, it comes down to people's desire for something that only God can fulfill, and that's to be born again. Jesus says you have to be born again. You have to have a new identity. This is a desire put within our soul. But if we don't turn to Him for that new birth, then the biggest cultural counterfeit that people will say, this is my identity, is to come out in some way related to their sexuality or their gender. This is who I am. These are my people. This is my community. This is my identity. And they're longing for that rebirth, that new identity that Jesus has put inside of us, a longing for that. But they're trying to fulfill that in a physical way where it can only be really fulfilled in a spiritual way through Christ. Yeah. And so I have a lot of compassion for folks that are caught up in a lot of that confusion. Is because I know at a heart level, they're crying out for something that Jesus wants to give them, which is a new birth and a new identity in Him. And ultimately trying to find it through sex, trying to find it through changing our gender, changing anything about ourselves apart from Christ, it's going to prove to be a dead end. And Jesus is there with grace when we finally figure that out to welcome us home.
Well, this has been a helpful conversation. One final thought from you. We're talking during this series about rhythms that people can practice to help grow in their health, in their marriage. So around sexuality, is there a rhythm that you would recommend people grow in?
Yes, I think number one, start talking about your sex life. I like Dave said kind of early on in this conversation, so many people, when we bring that up, they kind of freeze up a little bit, because just even the thought of talking about sex seems scarier than actually having sex, because it's so vulnerable. But that's the very thing that will actually grow your intimacy, because conversation is really the start of a great sex life. It's everything that happens outside of the bedroom that makes sex either better or worse inside the bedroom. And so if you've never really talked about it, what you like, what you dislike, just talk about it, how you're feeling outside of the bedroom, then I would challenge couples to do that. And number two, I would say pray about your sex life. And, whenever we say this from the stage when we're speaking, people kind of have this nervous giggle. But I always say, like, listen, sex was God's idea. It was completely His idea for marriage. So why in the world? We pray about all kinds of different things that God created. why in the world, as married people, would we not pray that God would bless our sex life? Because it would make all the difference in the world. And this is something we've been doing for a long time. And I'm telling you, there's a big difference when you're praying about sex than when you're not. So I would challenge couples listening to pray about sex. And those of you who are not married, pray about, for God to prepare you for that, and for you to hold tight to your standards to save yourself. And if you haven't saved yourself, to embrace, being a new creation, and to wait for that person now where you are in your walk with Christ. And thirdly, and we get this question all the time, and I'm sure you guys do too. People always ask us, anytime you're at a marriage conference, they're like, well, how many times a week, a month, or whatever should a married couple be having sex? And I would say, again, that gives you another thing to talk about.
Lots.
And I would just say, lots. I would say it needs to be a regular thing in your marriage.
Yeah, but it's not just
Regular.
about some magic number.
Yes.
It's about just
Happening
prioritizing.
often.
Yeah, just making each other a priority, serving one another, showing a lot of grace to one another,
Yes.
and making sure the marriage bed is the safest place on earth for both of you.
Yeah, that's so good. And even just those three things you mentioned before that, I think informs even that final question, right? Because if you're talking about it openly and you're asking God to bless that vulnerability, that confession, that honesty. I know for Gabe and I, when we started doing that in our sex life, like years, probably I would say the last 5 to 7 years, it did change. It changed the way I saw myself, my insecurities that I used to keep hidden, I just wouldn't talk about. Same for him. We would just actually go there, and the intimacy that grew out of just being honest and loving with what we were bringing each other, that helped so much. And then it didn't feel weird to pray about it either. We're like, God, we know that this is from you. Like, this is sacred. This is something you've appointed for us to not always have this weirdness about, but to actually be whole and healed in it. And as a result, like, praying about it felt normal too. And then all of a sudden the frequency increases because you're less like nervous or cautious about the whole thing. So I'm so thankful that you gave us those practical tools. Thank you guys for being on. We could obviously go on. And of course we are now besties. So we're going to just do this more often, clearly. But thank you.
We would love it.
Thank you for just being a part of this and for really just sharing your story, because I know that it's going to help a lot of people when they tune in.
Well, thanks for the amazing work you guys do. It really is a privilege to connect, and thanks for hosting this conversation.